Well, welcome back, and what a delight to have with us today Tom DiLorenzo. He's an economic expert and the author of an upcoming book that's probably going to be a must-read, The Problem with Socialism. Well, there you go. By the way, the book will be available on Amazon. You can go there and check it out. Hi, Tom. Good to see you.
Good morning. Good morning. Great to be with you.
Where are we Skyping you in from? Where are you?
I'm in Delray Beach, Florida, in South Florida.
Well, good for you. Nice and warm down there.
Far from
Well, Tom, what made you take this on? Because basically you're going after, if Hillary becomes president, what her economic policy would look like.
Yeah, well, there was a Pew Foundation poll recently that said that 69% of voters under 30 would vote for a socialist for president. And there was another poll that said 43% of the millennial generation preferred socialism over capitalism. And so I got together with Regnery Publishers and decided that it was time to write a book called The Problem with Socialism. And the title comes from something Margaret Thatcher once said, that the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money. And so I'm hoping that the problem with the millennials is that they just haven't been educated. And after all, who would educate them about this in our politically correct educational system? So that's my target audience.
On the other hand, Tom, Bernie did quite well, and he was a avowed socialist, and he has moved Hillary to the left. I don't know if the average citizen knows what socialism is.
That's exactly right. That's why another reason why I wrote the book, especially the younger people. Well, the first chapter I define it. It's in the early 20th century, it meant government ownership of the means of production. But then Friedrich Hayek, the famous author of The Road to Serfdom, wrote in the 1976 edition of that book that socialism evolved to mean income redistribution through the welfare state and the progressive income tax. And his teacher was an economist named Ludwig von Mises. And he wrote a book called Socialism in the 1920s, where he also said that what socialists have always been about is destructionism, that is, just trying to destroy the free enterprise system with taxes and regulations and inflation, whatever will work. And so that's what socialism means. And that's why my book has 16 chapters, all short chapters, very readable, in my opinion, that explain all aspects of socialism broadly defined.
It's been said, for the most part, given the two presumptive nominees, that this election cycle will be about socialism versus capitalism. Do you agree?
I agree. I had an article on Breitbart yesterday called America's Tipping Point. And I made the case that if you look at taxes at all levels of government, federal, state, and local, they account for between 35 and 40% of national income today. And if you add on top of that 75,000 pages in the Federal Register of regulations and state and local government regulation of industry, then our economy is pretty close to half socialist now, meaning the government either owns or controls that much economic activity. And I do believe we're at a tipping point. The first thing Hillary Clinton did after she got enough votes for the nomination was to announce that she agrees with Bernie Sanders on free higher education for all families making under $125,000 a year. And if that were to come into being, of course, it'll quickly go up to $200,000 because there's more votes there. And so she's every bit as much a socialist, in my opinion, as Bernie Sanders, only she doesn't use the S word. After all, she gave us Hillary Care, which was sort of a Soviet-style central planning of healthcare back in the Clinton administration.
Don't you think, Tom, that just in general economics, even liberals would understand that we can't sustain this debt? So if you hire somebody that's just going to pile on top of that, that we would be in serious trouble.
Yeah, but what the whole incentive system in politics is short-sightedness. Every member of Congress runs for re-election every 2 years, and so they're always focusing on what they can do for their constituents right now who will put them in office. That's why both parties are guilty of piling this gigantic public debt on us. And so it's in their self-interest as members of Congress to vote for deficits, Republicans and Democrats, with some exceptions. The extreme exception would be former Congressman Ron Paul, and there are others. He had a Liberty caucus in Congress when he was there, and so there are some good people in Congress, but they can't do anything about it. In fact, I gave a talk to Ron Paul and his Liberty caucus several years ago, and there was about 10 members of Congress there, and they all agreed that you can no longer make constitutional arguments against government programs anymore. You get laughed out of Congress when you do that. That's the state we're in right now.
Wow. All right, some of the endorsements of Hillary kind of also, I've always said people are policy. So she recently being endorsed by U.S. banker Hank Paulson. How significant is that?
I wrote an op-ed about that also a few weeks ago when Paulson endorsed her. He was the orchestrator of the bailouts of the big banks and the AIG insurance company, former Goldman Sachs CEO, and he's sort of the prototypical crony capitalist. He left Goldman Sachs. He orchestrated a $180 billion bailout of AIG, and then Goldman Sachs had $18 billion in claims on AIG. So he essentially used his job as Treasury Secretary to funnel $18 billion to his employer, and then he left the government and went back to Goldman Sachs. And that's the sort of crooked shenanigans that Hillary Clinton is famous for. And so they're birds of a feather, if you will. And I think the purpose of my op-ed that I wrote on Breitbart again a few weeks ago was to make this point that they're both equally corrupt in that regard. It's
been said that the hypocrisy with Hillary's statement about going after Wall Street when she has gleaned millions from Wall Street, do you think that could stick?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, if the people are paying attention, it'll stick with somebody. But, she's given all these $225,000 speeches to Goldman Sachs and the Saudis and everybody else. She's a crony socialist. Her ideology is more socialism than capitalism. And I call her a crony socialist. She wants to have it both ways. She wants to impose socialism on us, but for herself, she wants to become, ever more rich with her political connections. And as an economist, I've spent much of my career following in the footsteps of Adam Smith. Adam Smith's famous book, The Wealth of Nations, was an attack on what we today call crony capitalism. But back in his time, they called it mercantilism. And so there are a lot of us. I'm not the lone wolf out here who's making this point that this is crooked and destructive of our society. And the one thing about Donald Trump, it reminds me of when Schwarzenegger ran for governor of California. He gave a speech in that Terminator voice, and he said, "I'm the most highly paid actor in Hollywood, and I cannot be bought." And that got him elected governor of California, in my opinion. And I think that same thing is going to get Trump elected. People are sick of the crony capitalism.
Yeah. How corrupt is it at those levels? We hear about it. We hear about crony capitalism. I mean, if it's that corrupt, is it fixable?
It is fixable. Whenever conservatives always end up talking about, is there any hope? But, the Soviet Union imploded. There was a time when most of us never thought we would live long enough to see that happen. And we've had a lot of radical changes. During the Reagan administration, we had deregulation and tax cuts and some major improvements from an economic perspective. And so I think, I'm an optimist. I think this can improve. We're not going to reach perfection. But I think we're going down this slippery slope. As I said, we're on a tipping point, in my opinion, where government is so big and the Constitution is ignored so much that a Hillary presidency will really tip us over the edge, and bad things can only come of it in terms of our economy. We don't want to turn into Venezuela, after all. But I think we can turn that around if we educate enough of the public.
All right, let me take a break here. Tom DiLorenzo is with us, and is the author of a new book called The Problem with Socialism, coming out. It will be available on Amazon. We'll come back and have him highlight the book when we return. Just a moment.
I'm Paulina Leiser, producer of Focus Today. Thank you for watching this video, and make sure to check our other videos at thedove.us.
Welcome back, and what a delight to have with us today Tom DiLorenzo, economic expert and the author of an upcoming book. Be looking for it on Amazon. It's called The Problem with Socialism. There's a picture up there on the screen, and got a Pinocchio nose on there. Okay, Hillary with a Pinocchio nose. Anyway, be looking for it at Amazon shortly. It's called The Problem with Socialism. So what's the book about?
Well, The Problem with Socialism. It's aimed, the target audience is the millennial generation and their parents. And the idea is that, there's so many of these young people who are going off to college and who are Bernie Sanders supporters, or they think they're a socialist, or they support socialism because they like the offers of free stuff. And there's 16 chapters, and it covers why, just why it is that socialism doesn't work as an economic system. It talks about the economic reality in many countries of the world, the most recent of which is Venezuela, which went socialist in 1999, not that long ago, under the late Hugo Chavez. And today, people are rummaging through garbage in the streets looking for something to eat, and they've got 1,600% inflation, and a hamburger costs the equivalent of $170 in Venezuela today. So I talk about some real-world examples of socialism, and some of the other topics are reminding people that fascism was a form of socialism. The word Nazi meant National Socialism. I talk about the myth of Scandinavian socialism, how socialized medicine is harmful to your health and your pocketbook, and many other issues, how government regulation leads to monopoly rather than the opposite. And so there are 16 chapters overall that covers the welfare state, the progressive income tax, and all aspects of socialism. And I think of it as a companion book to a famous little book called Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, which a lot of conservatives especially are familiar with. It's written at about that level.
It's been said, Tom, that the three legs to the stool of socialism is you got to get control of the media, guns, and healthcare in order to facilitate total socialism. I guess economics would be wrapped in the middle of that. Does that make any sense?
Sure. Governments, especially totalitarian governments, have always made it a point to take over telecommunications, the educational system. If you read the Communist Manifesto, the 10-point platform in there, taking over the educational system was one of them. And it was the same with the Nazis and other totalitarian governments, and even less than totalitarian governments. And that's always been a priority. And of course, gun control. I've read quite a bit about this. James Madison himself, one of the reasons he gave for the Second Amendment was that the fear that a central government someday in the future would deprive the citizens of the American states of their rights. So he thought guns, an armed citizenry, was necessary to defend against their own central government, let alone foreign invaders. And so, that's, one of the basic reasons why we have the Second Amendment. And the tyrants of the world have always understood that, haven't they?
Yeah. Boy, that's one of the big battles today, no question about it. So in your opinion, what kind of a president would Hillary Clinton become?
Well, from an economic perspective, what we know about her is she's made a statement every once in a while. Her true self emerges at some speech she gives somewhere where she doesn't think the media are there, or she thinks the media who are there are incompetent. And I've quoted her in some of my writings as saying things like, we're going to tax you and use the money to spend on other people, and sort of a from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs mentality. And so she has always been ideologically a socialist. And when she was in power with her husband, like I said earlier, she's known for Hillary Care, which is really a Soviet-style central planning scheme where 7 political appointees would have been put in charge of the entire healthcare system. And the bizarre thing about that is this was just a couple of years after the implosion of the Soviet Union that demonstrated the utter failure of that system and all over the world. And so that's where she is coming from. And I think she would explode the government. She's already proposed, quote, free higher education for the most part in the United States, and in a greatly expanded welfare program. She's proposed a something that George McGovern got sort of laughed out of politics for in the early 70s. She's proposed a government-funded basic income of $5,000 for every child born that they would be able to get their hands on upon reaching voting age of 18, conveniently. And so, and that sort of socialistic nonsense is probably what got Nixon elected after McGovern came up with that in 1972. But that's also Hillary Clinton's position. And so she would blow up the welfare state, and she has no qualms about the nationalization of major industries like healthcare.
You know, what really concerns me about this as well, Tom, is that under a Republican-controlled House and Senate, they've allowed this president to get away with executive abuse of powers. And if she becomes president, that has now set the precedence by which she could almost dictatorially govern.
That is true. You know, if you go online and look up the list of federal government czars, you know, the energy czar and the weapons of mass destruction czar, we have, I think there are 38 of them now, the last I looked. And this is a way to sort of end run Congress and the people, and appoint people to these positions that are unaccountable pretty much to anybody. And that would, I think Obama created as many as any president has in our history, although President Bush was right up there with him. And so, yeah, I would expect Hillary Clinton to go full bore on that. And you know, she's of the type also that I wouldn't put it past her to create a crisis like a war, for example, to grab a hold of even additional powers. That's been our history. I mean, President Lincoln did it during the Civil War. President Roosevelt did it during his time. Woodrow Wilson did it during his time. And Hillary Clinton is such a political animal and such a socialist. I would not put it past her to fabricate some sort of crisis to grab hold of even more dictatorial powers, maybe along the lines of what the Turkish president is doing today.
Wow. All right. Given your economic background, what does the non-politician, very successful businessman Donald Trump look like to you?
Well, this is a man who spent his entire life creating economic value. And he does have a master's degree from the Wharton School, you know, the prestigious Wharton School. And the things he's been talking about is cutting taxes, cutting back on government spending, or at least the rate of growth of government spending. He's very concerned about the Fed creating too much inflation, would like to rein that in. And so I think he talks a lot of sense. You know, when he criticizes trade deals, I'm a free trader. I'm a free market economist, but I was against NAFTA because I didn't believe that several thousand pages of regulations written by corporate, labor union, and environmentalist lobbyists could conceivably be free trade. And it has not turned out to be free trade. And so when he criticizes that, I'm all with him. And I think it's a good idea. That needs to be rethought and reworked. And so we would move in a dramatically different direction. And I think he would be open to ideas from the types of economists who advised Ronald Reagan in moving in deregulation, lower taxes, economic freedom, more free enterprise, and less government. And because he knows that works, he's spent his whole life working in that playground.
You know, a lot of Republicans supported NAFTA and still support NAFTA. And if he becomes president, he's going to have some tug-of-war going on. And a lot of them still support the WTO. How big of a challenge is that for him to get our trade back into balance?
Well, he's taken on the crony capitalist Republicans, hasn't he? These are the Republicans who have tried to destroy him all throughout the primaries and are still at it to this day. They never seem to give up because he wants to get rid of deals like that benefit only people like them and not the average American. And he's been pretty successful so far in doing that. And President Reagan had to battle with some of the same people, but he, of course, was famous for his genius in going over the heads of the special interests and talking to the American people and getting them behind him. And we will see. I think Donald Trump so far is very good at getting many millions of people behind him and going over the heads of the media. And don't we all love how he castigates the liberal media?
It's fun to watch. What's your take on the UK coming out of the EU and economically how that may impact us?
I think it's all great for the British and great for the world because the EU is sort of a super central planning agency that its main objective was never really free trade, but to prohibit any individual country in Europe that was a member from cutting taxes and cutting regulations and being more sensible about these things. It was sort of a super cartel of governments, which is why the majority of the British people voted to get out of it. And it's very telling that as soon as that vote was taken, the EU leaders themselves came right out and in your face and said, this is what we want to do. We want a super central state, not a one world government, but a one Europe government. That's what we really want, to essentially abolish sovereignty in England and France and Germany and elsewhere. And so the mask came off in this unguarded moment after Brexit. And so to me, that proves even more what a great thing the Brexit vote was. And I would like to see other countries in Europe do the same thing. After all, there's a long history of why subsidiarity and decentralized government is so superior to centralized government. I always thought it was ironic that just after we got rid of the Soviet Union, the Europeans created the European Union with many of the same attributes, not the brutal repression, but from an economic perspective, centralized planning. And that was a bad road for them to go down.
I'm sure you can imagine what it would be like had the UK subordinated the pound to the euro. This would have never happened.
Yes, it would have never happened. I'm glad they always kept the pound and provided a lesson to all the other Europeans and the world, I think, with regard to the virtues of more decentralized government over centralized power and planning that always only benefits a small elite. Even in Venezuela, which I mentioned earlier, I've been reading that the wealthiest person in that country today is the 35-year-old daughter of the late Hugo Chavez, and she's worth $4.2 billion. And that's what centralized government socialism does. It creates a privileged political elite that enriches itself by imposing misery on everybody else. And I'm certainly glad that at least a large segment of the British people have caught on to this scam that is the EU.
Tom, I got about a minute left there. You're fascinating. I got to get you back. But let me ask you this. Whether it's Hillary or Donald, what do you think the world response, economic response will be quickly on Hillary and quickly on Donald if they were to get elected?
Well, the reality is that Hillary is reckless and dangerous on foreign policy, and she's a socialist on economic policy. And so the markets will respond negatively to a Hillary election as far as that goes. And I think the world will be much more unstable with a loose cannon in charge as commander-in-chief with Hillary Clinton. Not that Donald Trump is perfect or a genius, but I think he would be less threatening. To me, it's refreshing to hear an American politician at that level say he would rather do business with the Russians than go to war with them.
Got to go, Tom. Yeah, sorry, I hate to cut you off, but his new book is called The Problem with Socialism. It will be available on Amazon shortly. Thank you, Tom. Let's connect again, okay?
My pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
All right, again, check it out. The Problem with Socialism. It'll be on Amazon by Tom DiLorenzo. We'll see you next time.